China will overtake the United States as the world's largest economy by 2035. While the US GDP grew by less than 2%, China's GDP grew by over 4.4% in 2022. This graph perfectly illustrates how fast China is taking not just the US, but the world, while its neighbors such as Japan, that has the best chance to compete with China, is stuck for decades. Its military budget grew from $22 billion in 2000 to almost $300 billion by 2021, making European powers like Russia, France, or UK that once dominated the world irrelevant. It hasn't just turned into a factory that supplies the world with cheap materials, but has risen to produce high-tech electronics, from smartphones that compete with iPhone to electrical cars that would put Tesla to shame. Its marvelous infrastructure projects has put the US to shame when it can't even finish the California high-speed railway. It's building roads, ports, cities across Africa, expanding its soft power across the globe and making the world ever more dependent on China. It has launched Belt and Road Initiative and already spent over $1 trillion across the globe, making it the largest global project in the world. It built some of the wealthiest cities in the world in just a few decades. It's United States' largest trade partner. But underneath this great success, there is a harsh reality, a reality that China doesn't want you to know. When you look deep inside China, you realize that China is suffering from crises that it still doesn't know how to solve. It's not a tech problem or a financial crisis, although China is on the brink of a financial catastrophe. But it's still solvable to a certain extent. China's real problems are beyond what many of you think. China is running out of water. Its energy sector is about to collapse, which is putting its food supplies at risk. These three crises are about to destroy everything that China has achieved in the last 30 years. And if you combine that with unprecedented population crisis, then you have a perfect recipe for a disaster. A disaster that could bring China's $18 trillion GDP to its knees. But before we do that, give this video a thumbs up and let's dive in. The situation has gotten bad enough to cause huge shocks here in the US. Now, the S&P 500 just wrapped its worst year since the 2008 crisis, and Bank of America is warning that it could flatline this year. Flatline. The market is demanding a much more active approach, and Masterworks has already helped over 600,000 people take control. They've been featured in publications like Business Insider, the Financial Times, and recently awarded one of the LinkedIn's top 50 startups. Their team, drawn from the institutions like Bank of America or Sotheby's, is revolutionizing art investing. It might sound skeptical, but Masterworks does not do NFTs or crypto. With Masterworks, you're investing in real physical paintings qualified with SEC, which I have linked in the description. You can also check on your Masterworks profile at any time, and third-party appraisers provide quarterly appreciation estimates. To date, Masterworks has filed over 200 paintings with the SEC, ranging from $500,000 to $25 million. And while many have been panic selling or deep buying, Masterworks paid out $25 million in the last 12 months alone. That includes 3 sales in just 60 days, which returned 10, 13, and 35% net to their investors. Paintings have sold out in less than an hour, but use my link below to check out Masterworks and your account will be preloaded with priority access. And now, let's get back to the video. China's economic success came at a huge cost. Rapid urbanization and industrialization led to pollution and damaged many of its rivers. In the last 20 years alone, almost 28,000 rivers had vanished, making the already huge problem even worse. Rivers are the bloodline of any society. Wherever you look at the world, communities have always emerged across rivers that turned into cities and eventually countries. Because Water is the foundation of life. China has over 20% of the entire global population, but only 6% of fresh water reserves. And since 2013, at least half of China's water reserves are considered inappropriate for human consumption, which puts the entire future of the country at danger. The water scarcity threatens the very survival of the Chinese nation, because without fresh water, the agriculture sector will suffer, which will create a shortage of food, especially when you have a population of 1.4 billion people. China already once went through a food crisis. It didn't go well. In just 3 years, from 1958 to 1961, some 30 million Chinese starved to death, and about the same number of births were lost or postponed. China currently consumes around 600 billion cubic meters of water annually, which is not sustainable based on how much reserve it actually has. But based on projections, its consumption is only going to grow to at least 800 billion cubic meters by the end of the decade. How China is planning to solve this crisis is a question even China doesn't have. All of its attempts so far has failed. Geography isn't always playing to China's favor. The absolute majority of China's population lives in the northern eastern side of the country, where most of the farmland is located. But that's not the case with its rivers. Most of China's water supplies are located in the southern part of the country. So the CCP tried to change that by building a $62 billion south-north water transfer project. The aim of the project are to divert 45 billion cubic meters of water per year from Yangtze River in southern China to the Yellow River, which is its second largest river, since the Yellow River has already decreased by more than 90%, which is making the water crisis in the north even worse. For the context, when the project completes, it will be the largest water diversion transfer project ever undertaken. It has already taken 50 years to plan and begin construction, and won't finish until 2050. In Beijing, for example, 2/3 of all water comes from the groundwater, but due to pollution, over 80% of water in the north has become undrinkable. That had such a serious impact on China's agricultural potential that a decade ago, China became the world's largest importer of agricultural goods. Its arable land has been shrinking due to pollution and water shortages. To top it off, water is heavily subsidized by the government. So water is not effectively used in the country since it's cheap because of the government subsidies. The government understands that it needs to lift those subsidies to increase water consumption efficiency, but that could hurt China's growth. The whole narrative in China is that people won't intervene in government affairs while the CCP guarantees the annual GDP growth numbers. So by lifting government subsidies, the CCP could risk its reputation and the social contract it has with the people. Water shortages leads to other problems such as a shortage of energy. China consumes over 80% of its energy from coal, but to produce energy from coal, you need a lot of water, which puts the entire country's future at risk. Factories across China, such as Tesla and Apple, had to shut down due to energy cuts, halting production. The question that many of you are probably wondering is, why China can't shift to wind and solar when the renewable energy solves the problem? Unfortunately, China is unlucky with its geography. As we have mentioned before, almost entire China's population live in the east side of the country, closer to the coastline, while most of the wind is mainly in the west side of the country. The same goes to the sun rays. They're mostly in the southwest of the country. Transporting the energy to the eastern side of the country makes the whole process inefficient. With most of its rivers drying up, China can't even rely on its dams to generate enough electricity, which is why coal is its main source of energy. In 2023, where the world is shifting to renewable energy, most of China's energy consumption comes from coal, more than 62%, while gas and oil make only 8 and 20% respectively. So, despite that Russia has been selling oil and gas to China at a significantly lower price than market price, it is still not solving the crisis. It's just giving Beijing a little more time. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine created a different problem. Since Russia cut supply of gas to Europe, Europe was forced to go back to its coal plants, increasing the demand for coal, which means higher prices. Prices rose from $70 in 2019 to over $400 by 2022. Imagine for a moment how strongly that hit China's economy that relies heavily on coal as its main source of energy. Coal is the backbone of China's economy, and it's at stake. Coal prices are insanely high, and domestic production requires a lot of water, which China doesn't have. About 250 liters of fresh water is required per ton of coal production. China is in a paradox. Its ultimate objective is to be world's superpower, but it's never going to achieve that if at the end of the road it will find itself lacking the energy and fresh water, since they are the main components of functioning economy. But if it focuses on solving these problems, then its annual GDP growth won't be as impressive as they have been in the last 3 decades. That could question the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, creating turmoil in the country.